Sometimes, a single night can change everything. A struggling single father, a shattered car, a mysterious heiress on the run. When broken souls collide under a rain-soaked sky, a simple act of kindness sparks a chain of miracles neither of them could have imagined. Stay with us as we unravel a story of resilience, redemption, and a love born from the unlikeliest of places. If stories of hope and second chances touch your heart, we invite you to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us share more journeys that remind us all. Sometimes, the most extraordinary beginnings are hidden within the most ordinary nights. The rain came down in heavy sheets, rattling the corrugated roof of Hart's garage like 1,000 desperate fists. Inside, under the flickering light of a single failing bulb, Graham Hart wrestled with a rusted bolt deep inside the engine bay of a weathered 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air. His hands, calloused and cracked from years of work, were slick with oil and rainwater. His muscles screamed from fatigue, but he gritted his teeth and pressed on. He didn't have the luxury to rest tonight. Just hours earlier, a young woman had stumbled into the garage, soaked to the bone, her thin jacket clinging to her shivering frame. She had driven the Bel Air through the pounding storm, its engine wheezing and sputtering like a dying man. Graham had seen desperation before, in the hollow faces of soldiers returning from wars, in the grief-stricken eyes of men who had lost everything. But the desperation in her eyes was different. It was raw, personal, immediate. "They're looking for me," she had whispered, voice barely carrying over the storm. "If they find me by morning, I won't be free." Graham hadn't asked questions. He hadn't needed to. He simply nodded, pulled the car into the bay, and set to work. There were moments in life when a man didn't need explanations, just instinct, and a memory of what it meant to lose someone because you acted too late. He thought of Elise, his late wife, the way her fingers had slipped from his grasp in that sterile hospital room, the promise he had made at her bedside. "I won't let fear stop me again." And so, Graham worked through the night. Now, under the relentless hammering of rain, exhaustion gnawed at the edges of his vision. His breath came ragged, white puffs in the cold air. Every movement felt like dragging a mountain uphill. Still, he twisted the wrench harder, willing the stubborn bolt free. He had to get that engine running, if not for the girl, Lila, she had said her name was, then for the part of himself that still believed a man's worth was measured not by what he said, but by what he did when no one else was looking. A soft sound interrupted his thoughts, a cough, muffled, from the girl curled up on the battered sofa in the corner. Sophie, his 8-year-old daughter, was asleep on the adjacent chair. A book slipped from her tiny hands to the floor. Graham's heart clenched. He was failing her, too, working himself into the ground while she waited for promises he wasn't sure he could keep. One last bolt. One last push. He leaned in, and the world tilted sharply. The wrench slipped from his grasp with a loud clang, and Graham staggered back, bracing himself against the hood of the Bel Air. Spots danced before his eyes. His knees buckled. And then, darkness. When he awoke, the rain had softened to a steady drizzle. The garage lights buzzed weakly overhead. His body ached in places he hadn't known could ache. He tried to move, but found himself anchored by a small, trembling hand wrapped tightly around his own. It was Lila. She was kneeling beside him, her hair plastered to her cheeks, her face pale and streaked with rainwater and tears. Her other hand clutched his work shirt near the collar, as if afraid he might vanish if she let go. "You're my only hope," she whispered. The words were so fragile, so painfully human. They cracked something inside him. Graham blinked slowly, struggling to focus. He saw past the grime and grease, past the broken car and the broken dreams it represented. He saw a young woman utterly alone, fighting a battle bigger than herself. He saw Sophie, only a few feet away, her small chest rising and falling in sleep. He saw himself, a man who once promised never to turn away when it mattered most. He squeezed Lila's hand lightly, his voice a rasp. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The rain outside slowed to a soft patter, like a heartbeat steadying after a long panic. Finally, with effort, Graham sat up. His body protested, but he ignored it. He turned to the Bel Air, its battered frame seeming to breathe with him in the low light. It was more than a car now. It was a lifeline, a bridge. "I'll get it running," he said, more to himself than to her. "Whatever it takes." Lila's lip trembled, but she nodded fiercely, wiping her face with the sleeve of her jacket. They didn't need grand promises, just action, just heart, just enough strength to believe that maybe, just maybe, broken things could be rebuilt. Outside, dawn was beginning to edge the clouds with faint gold. Inside Hart's garage, 3 broken souls huddled together, bound by a battered Bel Air, a silent promise, and the fragile, defiant hope that healing was still possible. Even here, even now, the smell of rain and motor oil lingered thick in the air as Graham helped Lila to her feet. His own legs trembled under the weight of exhaustion, but he forced himself upright. There was still work to do. The Bel Air loomed in the center of the garage, its battered body a quiet testament to better days. Graham ran a hand over the hood, feeling the faint outlines of a once proud emblem beneath his calloused fingers. He imagined the car in its prime, gleaming in the sunlight, cruising down a main street somewhere, with the world laid out wide and endless ahead. "She belonged to my father," Lila said softly, her voice breaking the heavy silence. She stood beside him, arms wrapped tightly around herself. "He bought it the year I was born. He said it would be mine one day, if I ever needed to find my way back home." Graham turned his head slightly, studying her in the dim light. Her wet hair clung to her cheeks, her hands shook, not just from the cold, but from something deeper. Fear. Grief. "You running from someone?" he asked, keeping his voice low, careful. She hesitated. For a moment, he thought she might lie. But then, she lifted her chin, a flicker of defiance burning in her tired eyes. "From everything," she whispered. "From a life that was never really mine." Graham didn't press further. He had learned long ago that the truths worth knowing were often the ones people needed time to say out loud. Instead, he walked to the workbench, grabbed a thick woolen blanket from the shelf, and draped it over her shoulders. "Get some rest," he said, gesturing toward the old sofa where Sophie was still sleeping soundly, oblivious to the storm outside and the storm raging inside the garage. Lila hesitated again, then nodded. She crossed the room, moving carefully, as if afraid her very steps might shatter this fragile shelter she'd found. She curled up on the far end of the sofa, pulling the blanket tight around her, but her eyes remained wide open, staring at the broken Bel Air. Graham returned to the car. He couldn't remember the last time he had been this bone-deep tired. His hands were raw, his shoulders stiff, and every joint screamed for mercy. Yet as he opened the toolbox and selected a socket wrench, he felt a grim sense of purpose. The Bel Air wasn't just a car anymore. It was a promise. Sometime before dawn, as he worked in weary silence, a small, soft voice spoke from behind him. "Is she staying with us, Daddy?" Graham looked over his shoulder. Sophie sat up, rubbing the sleep from her eyes with small fists. She looked so tiny, wrapped in the oversized quilt he had thrown over her earlier, her hair a tousled halo around her head. He set the wrench down and crossed to her, kneeling so they were eye level. "For a little while," he said gently. "She needs our help." Sophie blinked up at him, her face serious in that way only children could be. Like Mommy needed your help? The question hit him harder than any blow could have. For a moment he couldn't speak. Elise's memory was never far from him, but tonight it loomed larger, sharper. Yeah, he said finally, his voice rough. Like Mommy. Sophie nodded solemnly, as if she understood something bigger than words could capture. Then, without another word, she slipped off the sofa and padded over to Lila. She gently tucked the blanket closer around the sleeping woman, and satisfied, returned to curl up in her chair. Graham swallowed hard against the lump rising in his throat. Maybe children understood better than adults how fragile hope could be, and how fiercely it needed to be protected. As morning approached, Graham sat back on his heels, surveying his work. The engine was still a mess, but he had coaxed enough life into it that he believed he could get it running. He would need parts, though. Parts he didn't have, and no money to buy them. He rubbed a hand over his face, feeling the grime and weariness layered there. Behind him, Lila stirred. "You should sleep," she murmured, voice raw from disuse. Graham shook his head. "Can't. Too much to do." Lila pushed herself upright, the blanket slipping from her shoulders. In the early light filtering through the grimy windows, Graham could see how young she really was. Barely more than a girl, carrying burdens far heavier than she ought to bear. "You don't even know me," she said, almost accusingly. "Why are you doing this?" Graham leaned back against the tool bench, folding his arms across his chest. "Maybe I don't," he admitted. "But I know what it feels like to have no one left to count on." Lila stared at him for a long moment, something breaking open behind her guarded expression. Then she looked away, blinking hard. "I don't have anywhere else to go," she said. "You do now," Graham answered. The words hung between them, simple and unadorned, but somehow heavy with meaning. Lila's shoulders sagged, as if some invisible weight had lifted, even just a little. For the first time since she had entered the garage, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't entirely alone. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. The sun was struggling to break through the heavy clouds, casting a faint golden glow over the worn floorboards and battered tools. Inside Hart's garage, against all odds, a fragile new beginning was taking root. The faint morning light filtered through the cracked windows of Hart's garage, washing the concrete floor in a muted gold. Dust hung like tiny spirits in the shafts of sunlight, swirling lazily around the battered Bel Air that sat proudly in the center of the room, a relic of dreams long past but not forgotten. Graham wiped his hands on a rag, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. He hadn't slept in over 24 hours, but he didn't care. His body could collapse later. For now, the battered Chevy demanded his attention, and so did the two souls resting quietly nearby. Sophie was awake now, perched cross-legged on a stool near the workbench, absently sketching in an old notebook Graham had found for her months ago. Her face, usually so guarded since Elise's death, was unusually serene. Every so often, she glanced toward Lila, who was slowly sipping a mug of coffee Graham had managed to brew from his dwindling stash of supplies. There was something delicate about the moment, something Graham didn't want to break by speaking too loudly or moving too quickly. It was as if the garage itself was holding its breath. He approached the Bel Air again, running a hand over the hood. He could feel the soul of the machine beneath the chipped paint and rusted chrome, a spirit too stubborn to give up, just like the girl who had brought it here. "It's beautiful," Sophie said suddenly, her small voice breaking the silence. Graham turned to find her watching him, her pencil paused mid-sketch. "It was," he agreed, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "And it will be again." Sophie nodded solemnly, as if she understood the promise tucked inside his words. Lila set down her coffee and stood, moving carefully toward the car. She reached out, fingertips barely grazing the edge of the doorframe. "My father used to say," she murmured, almost to herself, "that this car would always find a way home." A voice wavered on the last word, and Graham felt something twist inside his chest. "You'll get there," he said softly. "We'll get you there." She looked up at him then, eyes wide, vulnerable. There was a depth to her gaze that made Graham feel as if he were standing at the edge of a cliff, one misstep away from falling into something far bigger than he could control. Before he could say anything else, a coughing fit shook Lila's frame. She doubled over slightly, clutching the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "Hey, easy," Graham said, moving instinctively to her side. "You're freezing." "I'm fine," Lila rasped, though her chattering teeth betrayed her. "No, you're not," he shook his head. "You need real rest, a warm bed, proper food." Lila flinched, as if the very idea of being cared for was more terrifying than the threats chasing her. "I can't stay long," she said, voice tight. "If I do, they'll find me." Graham knelt to meet her eye level, speaking low and firm. "You're safe here. No one knows you're here. And that car," he gestured to the Bel Air, "isn't going anywhere until I say so." For the first time, a flicker of reluctant trust crossed her face. Sophie slid off her stool and approached shyly, still clutching her notebook. "Do you want to see?" she asked Lila, holding the notebook out. Lila hesitated, then crouched down carefully, accepting the offering with both hands. Her fingers brushed Sophie's, and Graham caught the faintest intake of breath from her. The drawing was simple, childlike, pencil lines forming the unmistakable outline of the Bel Air. But in Sophie's version, the car gleamed, brand new, surrounded by flowers and bright skies. It wasn't just a car, it was hope given shape. Lila pressed a hand to her mouth, blinking rapidly. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Sophie beamed, cheeks coloring with pride. "Daddy says we can fix anything if we work hard enough." Lila's gaze lifted to meet Graham's, and in that unspoken exchange, something shifted between them. Not romance, not yet, but something perhaps even more important. Faith. Faith that broken things could be mended. Faith that broken people could too. The day wore on quietly. Graham continued to work on the Bel Air, with Sophie occasionally handing him tools or keeping him company with quiet chatter. Lila helped where she could, though it was clear she was fighting her own physical limits. As afternoon faded into evening, Graham wiped his forehead with the back of his sleeve and stepped back to admire their progress. The engine coughed to life once, weak, sputtering, but it was a heartbeat nonetheless, a sign that resurrection was possible. He grinned at the two watching from across the room. "We're getting there," he said, voice light with a warmth he hadn't felt in what seemed like forever. Sophie clapped her hands, and Lila smiled. A real smile, small but genuine. It lit up her face in a way that made Graham's heart stutter slightly in his chest. They were strangers, thrown together by circumstance and desperation. And yet, in this battered garage filled with rust and rainwater, they were starting to build something fragile and precious, a second chance. The sun had barely begun its slow crawl across the sky when Graham closed the hood of the Bel Air and wiped his hands on a rag that was already stained beyond saving. He leaned back against the workbench, surveying the car with a strange sense of pride, and an even stranger feeling of hope. The engine was alive again, but it was fragile, like a heartbeat, after too long a silence. Just like the people inside this garage, battered, but breathing. Sophie sat cross-legged nearby, humming to herself as she colored in her sketchbook. Lila stood a few feet away, arms wrapped tightly around her midsection as if holding herself together. Her eyes flickered between Graham and the Bel Air, torn between gratitude and uncertainty. "You did it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Graham shrugged, pretending not to notice the way her voice cracked on the words. "She's running. Barely. She needs a lot more work before she's roadworthy." Lila exhaled slowly, as if she'd been holding her breath for days. She stepped closer to the car, brushing her fingers lightly across the hood. "Thank you," she said, and Graham could tell she meant it in a way that went far deeper than just the car. "You're welcome," he said simply. For a few moments, the only sounds were the distant chirping of birds and the soft scratch of Sophie's pencil against paper. Then Lila spoke again, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I can't stay here long. If they find me, if my family tracks me down, they'll drag me back. I need to keep moving." Graham crossed his arms over his chest, studying her. "You're not strong enough to travel yet," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "And that car's not ready either. You leave now. You won't get far." Lila pressed her lips together, frustration flashing across her face. "I don't have a choice," she said. "You don't understand what they'll do." Graham let out a slow breath, choosing his words carefully. "Maybe I don't," he admitted. "But I know what it's like to feel trapped, to think you have no way out." He thought of Elise, the hospital bills piling up, the helplessness of watching someone you love slip away while you stood there, useless. He wouldn't stand by again, not when he had the power to help. "You can stay here," he said finally. "Both of you." Lila blinked, startled. "Both of us?" He gestured to the Bel Air. "You and the car." A ghost of a smile tugged at her lips. "And what's the catch?" "No catch," Graham said. "You help me around the garage. Simple things. Cleaning, organizing. Maybe keep an eye on Sophie when I'm working." At the mention of Sophie, Lila's gaze softened. She glanced over at the little girl, who was now carefully shading in the windows of a house she had drawn. A house with a big front porch and a bright red door. Hope, sketched in pencil and dreams. Lila turned back to Graham, her defenses crumbling. "Okay," she said, voice trembling. "Okay." Graham nodded. The deal settled without a handshake, without paperwork. Just two battered people clinging to the fragile promise of something better. The following days unfolded like cautious steps across thin ice. Lila proved to be more helpful than Graham had dared hope. She was clumsy with tools, but meticulous with details. She organized the cluttered garage with a precision that made him wonder if she'd been born into a world of order and control. Sophie, to Graham's quiet amazement, attached herself to Lila almost immediately. They spent hours together, drawing, reading old books Graham had rescued from yard sales. Lila showed Sophie how to mix paints, how to capture light and shadow, breathing new life into the little girl's world. One afternoon, Graham returned from a supply run to find Sophie sitting cross-legged in the middle of the garage, a canvas propped in front of her. Lila knelt beside her, guiding her hand as she painted a rough but earnest portrait of the Bel Air. Sophie looked up as he entered, her face glowing. "Daddy, look, Lila's teaching me how to paint for real." Graham smiled, warmth flooding his chest. He met Lila's eyes across the room, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition that this wasn't just survival anymore. This was rebuilding. This was healing. That night, after Sophie had fallen asleep curled up with a book in the tiny loft above the garage, Graham sat outside on the steps, staring up at the stars. The air was cool, filled with the earthy scent of rain-soaked wood and oil. Lila joined him, wrapping herself in an old quilt Graham had found. She sat a careful distance away, but close enough that he could feel the tremble still in her bones. "Thank you," she said after a while, her voice barely more than a breath. "You don't have to keep saying that," Graham replied. "I do," Lila insisted. She twisted the corner of the quilt between her fingers. "I don't think anyone's ever stood up for me without wanting something in return." Graham's jaw tightened. He hated the idea of anyone, especially someone as quietly brave as Lila, being treated like a pawn in someone else's game. "You deserve better," he said simply. Lila turned to look at him, her face illuminated by starlight. "Maybe," she said, "but I don't know how to trust that yet." Graham nodded. He understood that too. Trust wasn't something you gave. It was something that was built, layer by careful layer, like restoring an old car, stripping away the rust, sanding down the rough edges, fitting each piece back together until it was strong enough to run again. He looked out over the quiet darkness and spoke without thinking. "You can start here." The days that followed fell into a kind of fragile rhythm. The chaos that had once filled Hart's garage, the clang of tools, the endless shuffle of disorganized parts, slowly gave way to a quieter, more deliberate hum of life. Each morning, Graham would wake before sunrise, slipping out of the cot he'd set up in the corner and pulling on his work boots with a groan. He would find Lila already awake most days, curled in the battered armchair with a mug of instant coffee, staring into the soft gray light seeping through the garage windows. Neither of them spoke much in those early hours. They didn't need to. The simple fact of their shared silence was its own kind of understanding. Sophie would tumble sleepily down the ladder from the loft a little later, rubbing her eyes and dragging her favorite blanket behind her. Lila always greeted her with a smile, brushing the girl's messy hair back from her face with a tenderness that caught Graham off guard every time he saw it. It wasn't just that Lila was good with Sophie, it was that Sophie had begun to trust her, something Graham hadn't seen since Elise's death. And maybe, just maybe, he was beginning to trust her too. The Bel Air became their shared project, a silent witness to their tentative steps toward something resembling hope. Graham handled the heavy work, replacing belts, checking the transmission, coaxing the ancient engine back to steady life. Lila took charge of the details, cleaning decades of grime from the interior, carefully polishing the fading chrome until it gleamed faintly under the fluorescent lights. One afternoon, as Sophie crouched beside Lila, wiping down the weathered leather seats, she looked up with a shy smile. "Did you ever ride in it when you were little?" she asked. Lila paused, her rag stilling in her hand. "Once," she said softly. "On my birthday. My dad drove me to the beach. We sang along to the radio with the windows down." Her voice grew distant, threaded with memories Graham could almost see. A golden afternoon, salty air, a child's laughter carried on the breeze. Sophie's eyes lit up. "Will you drive it again, when it's fixed?" Lila hesitated. She glanced over at Graham, who pretended to be very busy tightening a bolt. "I don't know," she said finally. "Maybe if I have somewhere to go." "You can stay here," Sophie said earnestly, as if the matter were simple and settled. Lila laughed, a soft, startled sound, and reached out to ruffle Sophie's hair. "Maybe I can," she said, and Graham heard the unspoken longing wrapped in her words. Maybe. Later that evening, after the sun dipped low and painted the world in dusky blues and purples, Graham found Lila sitting alone on the garage steps. She was barefoot, the soles of her feet blackened by oil-stained concrete, and her hair hung loose around her shoulders. He joined her silently, dropping onto the step beside her. They sat like that for a long while, the cool night air wrapping around them. "You're good with her," Graham said finally, nodding toward where Sophie's sleeping figure was visible through the cracked garage door. Lila shrugged, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. "I didn't think I would be," she admitted. "Kids always seemed complicated." Graham chuckled low in his throat. They are. But Sophie's got a good heart. She sees the good in people even when the world teaches her not to. Lila smiled faintly, tracing invisible patterns on the step with one finger. I wish I still could, she said, so quietly he almost didn't hear her. You can, Graham said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. You're just learning how again. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and Graham felt something shift deep inside his chest, a slow, almost painful crack opening where he had once sealed himself shut. You make it sound easy, she whispered. It's not, Graham said, but nothing worth doing ever is. They sat in silence after that, the words settling between them like old friends. Above them, the stars blinked to life one by one, scattered across the velvet sky. Graham tipped his head back, letting the vastness of it all fill him with a strange, fierce kind of peace. Here, in this broken-down garage, with its broken-down people and a broken-down car, something was mending. Something was beginning, and for the first time in a long, long while, Graham dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, broken things could be beautiful too. The following morning broke with a heavy stillness, the kind that settled deep into the bones and warned of something yet unseen. Graham stood at the garage entrance, sipping lukewarm coffee from a chipped mug as the early light crept across the cracked pavement. Inside, he could hear Sophie giggling as Lila tried, unsuccessfully, to braid her messy hair. The sound filled the garage with a warmth Graham hadn't realized he missed until it returned. He let the moment settle in his chest like a precious thing before he turned back to the Bel Air. Today, he thought, they might finally get the engine running smooth enough for a real test drive. The idea sparked something boyish and reckless in him, something he hadn't felt since before Elise's illness. It felt good to plan something for the future again, even if it was just a drive down an old country road. He set his mug down and wiped his hands on a rag when he heard it. A sound out of place, too sharp for morning peace. Tires crunching on gravel. Graham stiffened, every muscle in his body tightening instinctively. He stepped outside, squinting against the glare. A sleek black SUV was idling just beyond the property line, the engine rumbling low like a predator waiting for its moment. A man stepped out, well-dressed, sharp-eyed. Graham knew trouble when he saw it, and this man radiated it. The stranger adjusted his sunglasses, glancing around as if sizing up the place, and everyone in it. Graham felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He moved slowly, deliberately, blocking the view into the garage with his body. "Can I help you?" Graham called out, his voice calm but firm. The man smiled, thin, professional, without a hint of warmth. "Morning," he said. "I'm looking for someone. A young woman, mid-20s, traveling alone. Might have passed through here?" Graham kept his face neutral. "Don't see a lot of travelers this way." The man nodded as if he expected the lie. "If you do happen to see her," he said, pulling a business card from the inside pocket of his tailored jacket and offering it forward. "Give me a call." Graham didn't move to take the card. Behind him, he heard the soft scuff of a shoe. Lila appearing at the garage door, her face draining of color the moment she saw the man. Her body stiffened. Fear flashed across her features before she retreated into the shadows without a sound. The man's smile sharpened, predatory. Graham finally reached out and took the card, folding it once between his fingers without looking at it. "I'll keep an eye out," he said coolly. The man gave a slow, measuring nod, then climbed back into the SUV. Tires spun on gravel as he pulled away, but Graham didn't move until the vehicle disappeared around the bend. Only then did he turn and head back inside. Lila was sitting on the floor near the workbench, her arms wrapped around her knees, shaking. Sophie hovered nearby, confusion and fear written all over her face. Graham crouched down in front of Lila, speaking low. "You know him," he said. She nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "Who is he?" "My uncle's fixer," she rasped. "When someone doesn't cooperate with the family's wishes, they send him." Graham exhaled slowly, steadying his voice. "You told me you were running," he said, "but you didn't tell me they were hunting you." "I didn't know they'd come this far," Lila whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of terror. "I thought, if I got far enough, they'd give up." Graham's chest tightened. He thought about the black SUV, the man's predatory smile, the implication behind his polite words. They wouldn't give up. Not until they had her back. Not until they controlled her again. He looked over at Sophie, who was watching him with wide, worried eyes, clutching her sketchbook to her chest like a shield. He made a decision. "We're not sending you back," he said, his voice low and certain. Lila blinked up at him, tears brimming in her eyes. "But you don't even know me," she whispered. "I know enough," Graham said. "You're not a thing to be claimed. You're not a pawn in their game." He paused, struggling for the right words. "You're family now," he said finally. "You, me, Sophie, we fight for each other." A sob broke loose from Lila's throat, and she buried her face in her arms, shaking with the force of it. Graham placed a hand gently on her shoulder, steady, unyielding. They would find a way through this, together. That night, long after Sophie had drifted to sleep clutching a new drawing, one of the three of them standing proudly in front of the fully restored Bel Air, Graham sat alone in the garage, staring at the old car's faded blue frame. He thought about Elise, about promises made and broken, about second chances. He wouldn't fail again. Not Lila, not Sophie, not himself. He picked up a wrench and got back to work, the metallic clang echoing in the quiet night like a vow hammered into iron. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of rain and the faintest taste of coming storms. But inside Hart's garage, there was only resolve and hope. The following days at Hart's garage were marked by a tension so tight, it felt like one wrong move might snap it in two. Graham doubled down on securing the place, checking locks, reinforcing the doors, even moving a battered metal cabinet to block the front window. It wasn't much, but it was something. And something, he had learned, was always better than nothing. Sophie sensed the change, though no one had told her the full truth. She clung to Lila more often now, her natural instincts sharper than any adult's explanations could ever be. Graham caught the looks she gave him sometimes, questioning, worried, and each one carved a little deeper into his heart. They deserved better. He had to give them better. One afternoon, while the sun hung low and heavy in the sky, Graham sat with Lila at the old picnic table behind the garage, the Bel Air gleaming faintly just beyond them. He spread out a crude map of the area, circling routes and dead-end roads with a thick black marker. "If they come back," he said, tapping the map, "we'll need a head start. I've got friends who owe me favors, places you can disappear for a while." Lila sat stiffly across from him, arms wrapped tightly around herself. Her gaze drifted toward the Bel Air, then back to him. "I don't want to run anymore," she said, voice low but steady. Graham leaned back, studying her. There was a fierceness there now, a fire he hadn't seen when she first stumbled into the garage, wet and broken. "You might not have a choice," he said carefully. Lila shook her head. "I'm tired of hiding, tired of being afraid." Her hands fisted on the tabletop. "I don't want Sophie to grow up thinking running is the only way to survive." Graham's chest tightened at her words, because she wasn't just talking about herself. She was talking about all of them. He reached across the table, laying his calloused hand lightly over hers. "Then we fight," he said simply. "We fight smart, together." Lila blinked rapidly, but she didn't pull away. That night, the first real test came. Graham was in the garage tinkering with the Bel Air's carburetor when headlights flared against the windows. The deep growl of a heavy engine vibrated through the concrete floor. He wiped his hands quickly and strode toward the door, heart pounding. Outside, 2 vehicles idled at the edge of the property, one of them the same sleek black SUV from before. The other was a black pickup, its bed lined with unfamiliar silhouettes. Trouble. Real trouble. He turned back into the garage, locking the door with a click that sounded far too loud in the silence. "Lila," he called urgently. She appeared at the top of the stairs to the loft, where she had been helping Sophie with homework. "They're here," he said. Lila's face drained of color, but she squared her shoulders. "What do we do?" "We stay quiet," Graham said. "We stay together." He reached under the workbench, pulling out an old baseball bat, worn, chipped, but solid. It wasn't much, but Graham figured it was less about weapons and more about sending a message. This family wasn't going to be taken easily. Sophie clung to Lila's side, wide-eyed but silent, brave, like her mother had been. Someone pounded on the door. 3 sharp knocks. "Graham Hart," a voice called. Male, deep, with a practiced, faux-friendly lilt. "We just want to talk. Open up." Graham didn't move. Lila stiffened beside him, whispering under her breath. "That's him. My uncle's fixer." Another series of knocks, harder this time. "You're making this more difficult than it needs to be," the voice said. Graham inhaled slowly through his nose, steadying himself. They couldn't outfight them, not directly, but they could outlast them. He motioned for Lila and Sophie to retreat deeper into the garage. They ducked behind the Bel Air, crouching low. Graham stayed by the door, bat resting loosely in his grip. Minutes dragged by. More shouting, more pounding, but Graham didn't open the door. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, the engines outside roared to life again. Tires spat gravel as the vehicles peeled away, disappearing into the night. Silence returned, but it was a brittle, uneasy thing. When he was sure they were gone, Graham turned to Lila and Sophie. Lila's face was pale but set, her arms wrapped tightly around Sophie's small frame. "You don't have to stay," Lila whispered to him. "You could still tell them you didn't know me. Walk away. It's not too late." Graham crossed the garage in 2 strides and crouched in front of them, voice low but fierce. "I don't walk away from family," he said. "Not anymore." A single tear slid down Lila's cheek. She didn't wipe it away. Sophie, silent until now, reached out and took Graham's hand in her own. "Me neither," she said simply. The 3 of them sat there, huddled in the shadow of the Bel Air, breathing in time with one another. Outside, the night pressed heavy against the walls. But inside Hart's garage, their fragile bond held strong. They were scared, they were outnumbered, but they were not alone. And sometimes, Graham thought, that was enough. Sometimes, that was everything. The tension in Hart's garage didn't vanish overnight, but in the days following the confrontation, it transformed. It sharpened into resolve. Graham woke each morning with a new sense of purpose burning beneath his ribs. Fear still hovered at the edges of every shadow, but it no longer ruled them. Instead, it fueled them, drove them to work harder, live fuller, hold tighter to each other. They weren't just fixing a car anymore. They were fixing themselves. The Bel Air, once a rusted monument to forgotten dreams, now gleamed under the fluorescent lights like a promise half-whispered in the dark. Every day after breakfast, Graham and Lila worked side by side in the garage. He tackled the engine and suspension. She meticulously polished the chrome, restitched torn leather seats, and buffed the body until the faded blue paint caught and reflected the light like soft water. Sophie, ever their bright little shadow, flitted between them with sketchbooks and brushes, her hands always stained with some new hue of paint. One afternoon, Graham found her kneeling beside the Bel Air, tiny fingers pressing bright yellow daisies into the cracks around the headlights. He chuckled softly. "What are you doing, kiddo?" Sophie beamed up at him, eyes alight. "Making it happy," she said simply. "Even old cars deserve to smile." Graham's throat tightened unexpectedly, and he ruffled her hair, hiding his emotions behind a rough laugh. Out of the mouths of babes, he thought. She wasn't wrong. Later that evening, after Sophie had drifted off to sleep upstairs, Graham and Lila sat on the garage floor with mugs of lukewarm coffee between them, the Bel Air towering silently nearby like a benevolent guardian. "You've made this place feel like home," Lila said softly, tracing patterns in the dust with her fingertip. "I didn't think I'd ever feel that again." Graham leaned back on his elbows, studying her under the dim light. "You made it happen too," he said. "You and Sophie." She smiled, tired but genuine. "I used to think home was a place," Lila said, voice distant. "Some big house, some perfect life. But it's not." She looked over at him, her eyes shining in the semi-darkness. "It's people." Graham nodded slowly, feeling her words settle into something permanent inside him. "Yeah," he said, "it's people." A comfortable silence stretched between them, the kind that spoke of trust earned not through words, but through the simple act of staying when it would have been easier to run. The next morning, Graham woke to find Lila already hard at work in the garage. She was perched on a stool beside the Bel Air, carefully stitching a new seam into one of the old leather seats. He watched her for a moment, unseen, marveling at the quiet strength she carried now. The fear hadn't disappeared. It lingered in her posture, in the way her eyes darted toward the door sometimes. But it no longer defined her. She had chosen to stay, to fight, to believe. And because of that, so had he. Graham crossed the room, dropping a small envelope onto the workbench beside her. Lila looked up, brows knitting in confusion. "What's this?" He shrugged, feigning nonchalance. "Just something I picked up." She opened it carefully, her fingers trembling slightly. Inside was a brochure, simple, worn around the edges, but the bold lettering at the top was unmistakable. "Evening art classes. Adult. Beginner group." Lila stared at it for a long moment, her throat working silently. "I thought maybe," Graham said awkwardly, "if you ever wanted to, start painting again." He scratched the back of his neck, suddenly feeling 15 years old and tongue-tied. "You don't have to," he added quickly. "It's just, you're good. And Sophie looks up to you. A lot." For a heartbeat, Lila said nothing. Then, very carefully, she set down her needle and thread and threw her arms around him. Graham froze, more out of surprise than discomfort, but then he wrapped his arms around her, feeling the shaky breath she released against his chest. "Thank you," she whispered. He held her a little tighter. "Anytime." That night, after dinner, Sophie presented them with a new drawing. It was a simple scene, crudely rendered in crayon, but it caught Graham squarely in the chest. The Bel Air, shining under a clear blue sky. 3 figures standing proudly in front of it. A man, a woman, and a little girl holding both their hands. Family. Not by blood, but by choice. He met Lila's eyes across the table, and she smiled. That shy, brilliant smile that had started to bloom more often now. In that moment, Graham knew. Whatever storms still waited for them beyond the horizon, whatever ghosts still lurked in the shadows, they would face them. Together. Because sometimes you didn't find family. Sometimes you built it. One bolt, one sketch, one whispered hope at a time. The scent of grease and rain hung thick in the air the morning the letter arrived. Graham found it wedged awkwardly into the old mailbox that hadn't seen real use in years. It was hand-delivered. No postage stamp, no return address, just his name scrawled in sharp, deliberate handwriting across the front. He frowned as he carried it back inside, where Lila and Sophie were seated at the workbench, tinkering with scraps of fabric for new seat covers. The Bel Air stood behind them like a sentinel, its body gleaming under the soft overhead light. Lila looked up at his expression, immediately tense. "What is it?" she asked. Graham didn't answer. He broke the seal carefully and unfolded the single sheet of paper. The message was short, brutal. Return Lila Everhart immediately. No police, no questions. In exchange, full ownership of Hart's garage, cleared debts, and $200,000 in cash. He stared at the words, feeling a cold fury build inside him, the kind that settled deep and slow, dangerous not for its heat, but for its terrible, patient certainty. They thought he could be bought. They thought he would trade a life for a pile of money and a few fleeting comforts. They didn't understand him at all. He dropped the letter on the workbench, where Lila's eyes snagged on it. She read it once, twice, her face going pale. Sophie looked between them, sensing the shift in the room, even if she didn't fully understand it. Lila's hands trembled as she folded the paper closed. "You should take it," she said quietly. Graham blinked. "What?" She lifted her chin, forcing the words out. "You could have everything you've ever wanted. Security, a future for Sophie. You wouldn't have to struggle anymore." Graham took a step closer, voice low and fierce. "You think I care about any of that more than I care about you?" Lila dropped her gaze to the ground. "You should." Graham exhaled sharply, fighting the urge to shake her, to make her see. "Listen to me," he said, crouching down so they were eye level. "I lost Elise because I didn't fight hard enough, didn't believe enough that love could be bigger than the world trying to break it." He reached out, placing a hand over hers. "I won't make that mistake again. Not with you, not with Sophie, not with this family." Tears shimmered in Lila's eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely. "You'll lose everything," she whispered. Graham smiled, a small, broken, stubborn thing. "Maybe," he said, "but I'll still have the only things that ever mattered." That night, while Sophie slept upstairs, Graham and Lila sat side by side on the hood of the Bel Air, the night air cool and clean around them. Neither spoke for a long time. Finally, Lila broke the silence. "I used to think freedom meant running," she said, her voice steady. "Getting away from the people who tried to own me." Graham turned his head, watching her in the faint glow from the garage windows. "But it's not," she continued. "Freedom is choosing who you fight for, who you stay for." She looked at him, really looked at him, and Graham saw it, the decision hardening behind her eyes. "I'm staying," she said. Graham didn't answer right away. He didn't have to. He simply reached out and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. Above them, a shooting star streaked across the sky, burning a bright, defiant trail through the darkness. Neither of them made a wish. They didn't need to. They had already found what they were looking for. The next morning, Graham tacked the letter to the back wall of the garage with a rusted nail. Right between a faded photo of Elise and a child's crayon drawing of the Bel Air surrounded by flowers and sunshine. It didn't deserve any more thought than that. They had work to do, a life to build. And no one, not money, not threats, not fear, was going to take that from them again. Not now. Not ever. The morning sun rose golden and full over Hart's garage, casting long, warm beams across the gravel lot. The world smelled of fresh-cut grass and warm metal, of promise and beginnings. Today was the day. The Bel Air, no longer a battered relic, but a proud testament to perseverance, gleamed under the sun. Its chrome edges shone, its pale blue paint, still bearing the faint scars of its history, seemed to glow with a life of its own. Graham stood with his hands on his hips, staring at the car with a mixture of awe and disbelief. He ran a hand over the hood, feeling the smooth surface hum faintly beneath his palm. She was ready. Behind him, Sophie darted from foot to foot in excitement, clutching a hand-drawn sign that read, "Good luck, Bel Air," in bright, messy letters. Lila approached quietly, her hair loose around her shoulders, a soft smile tugging at her lips. She wore jeans and a white t-shirt smudged with grease, her bare feet dusted with the dirt and life of the garage. "You sure about this?" she asked, her voice gentle but teasing. Graham chuckled, a low sound that rumbled up from his chest. "Never been more sure about anything," he said. He tossed her the keys. Lila's eyes widened as she caught them. "Me?" Graham shrugged, a twinkle in his eye. "You started this journey. You should be the one to drive her." Lila hesitated, the keys warm in her hand. Her fingers closed around them tightly, as if she were afraid they might slip away. Then she smiled, wide, real, unburdened, and it was like watching the sunrise. "All right," she said. "Let's take her home." The engine rumbled to life on the first try, a deep, throaty purr that vibrated through the soles of their shoes. Sophie whooped with delight, and Graham grinned as he slid into the passenger seat beside Lila. The leather seats creaked familiarly. The steering wheel, worn smooth by decades of hands, fit perfectly in Lila's grip. She adjusted the mirror, took a deep breath, and pulled out of the garage. The gravel crunched under the tires as they rolled down the driveway and onto the quiet country road beyond. Fields stretched out on either side of them, golden with late summer wheat. The sky arched wide and blue overhead, endless and forgiving. Lila drove with careful reverence at first, as if afraid the dream might shatter if she moved too fast. But soon, the old Bel Air found its rhythm, the years falling away beneath its wheels, and she pressed a little harder on the gas. The wind tangled in their hair, the road unspooled endlessly before them. Sophie leaned out the back window, laughing freely, her little arms spread wide like wings. Graham watched Lila out of the corner of his eye. The way she smiled now, open, fearless, was worth more than any garage, any amount of money. It was priceless. It was everything. They drove for miles, passing fields and farms, old barns, standing crooked against the horizon. Every turn of the wheels was a silent declaration. We are still here. We have survived. We are free. Finally, they reached a small, worn bridge spanning a narrow river. Graham recognized it from years past, a forgotten place where kids used to dare each other to jump into the shallow water below. Lila pulled the Bel Air to a stop in the middle of the bridge. She turned off the ignition, and for a moment, the world held perfectly still. They climbed out of the car together, leaning against the railing, watching the river below shimmer in the morning light. Sophie skipped rocks across the surface, each splash a tiny celebration. Graham glanced sideways at Lila. She was staring at the water, a faraway look in her eyes. "You thinking about running again?" he teased softly. She shook her head, her smile slow and sure. "No," she said. "I'm thinking about staying." Graham felt something shift inside him, something that had been waiting, patiently, for this moment. He reached out, threading his fingers through hers. "You already have," he said. They stood there together, the Bel Air behind them, the river singing quietly below, the future wide open ahead. Whatever came next, they would face it together, not as survivors, as a family. Later, as they piled back into the car, Sophie declared that the Bel Air needed a name. Something special, she insisted, tapping her chin thoughtfully. Lila laughed. How about Hope? She suggested. Sophie's face lit up. Hope! She shouted, throwing her arms wide. That's perfect! Graham smiled as he watched them, feeling the truth of it settle in his chest like a second heartbeat. Hope, that's what they had built here. Not just a car, not just a new life, but a beacon that would carry them forward, no matter how rough the road became. Lila started the engine again, and the Bel Air, no, Hope, purred to life beneath them. They drove on, the bridge growing smaller behind them, the horizon stretching infinitely ahead. Together. Always together. Autumn swept gently across the hills, gilding the trees in copper and gold. The air grew crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke. At Hart's garage, the days unfolded slowly, sweetly. A new rhythm, a new life. The Bel Air, Hope, as Sophie insisted on calling her, sat proudly just outside the garage doors, polished to a soft gleam. She wasn't just a car anymore. She was a symbol, a testament. Inside the garage, the changes were even more remarkable. Gone was the clutter and chaos of old. In its place stood a warm, welcoming space where engines were repaired. Yes, but so were people. Graham had painted the walls a soft cream, hung framed drawings by Sophie alongside vintage car posters, and even cleared a corner where Lila set up a makeshift art studio. Above the front entrance, Graham had mounted a new hand-carved sign, Hart's Garage of Hope, a promise made visible. Business picked up slowly at first, an old neighbor needing a tune-up, a local farmer with a broken-down truck. But word spread, not just about the good repairs, but about something more, something harder to name, something like healing. People came not just for fixes, but for a place to breathe, for conversations over coffee, for laughter shared between the clang of tools and the hum of engines. And Graham, Lila, and Sophie were at the center of it all, threads woven tightly together by the simple, stubborn belief that broken things could be mended. One crisp October afternoon, Graham stood outside the garage, a steaming mug in his hands, watching Sophie and Lila decorate the Bel Air for the town's fall festival parade. Sophie perched on the front bumper, carefully taping small golden leaves along the hood. Lila stood beside her, laughing as a sudden gust of wind scattered a handful of decorations across the yard. Graham chuckled to himself and wandered over to help. Need a hand? He teased. Lila grinned up at him, her hair tousled by the wind. Always. He bent to pick up a stray garland, but Sophie's voice made him pause. You're like a real family now, she declared, beaming. Graham's heart squeezed. He glanced at Lila, who was already looking at him, her smile soft, sure, and full of something so tender it stole the air from his lungs. He reached out, brushing a leaf from her hair. Yeah, he said, voice rough with emotion. We are. That night, after Sophie was tucked into bed, Graham and Lila sat on the front steps of the garage, a worn quilt wrapped around their shoulders. Above them, stars scattered across the sky in a glittering tapestry. Lila leaned her head against his shoulder, a quiet sigh escaping her lips. You saved me, she said softly. Graham shook his head. You saved yourself. She smiled, eyes closed. Maybe. But you gave me a place to do it. He turned slightly, pressing a kiss to her hair. And you gave me a reason to believe again, he whispered. For a long while, they simply sat there, letting the night hold them. There were still challenges ahead, of course. Bills to pay, engines to fix, old fears to face down. Life didn't promise easy roads. But Graham had learned something through the long, painful journey that had brought them here. You didn't need perfect roads. You just needed the right people to walk them with. In the months that followed, Hart's Garage of Hope became more than a business. It became a sanctuary. Widowers came with broken tractors and left with repaired hearts. Single mothers found encouragement along with oil changes. Retired soldiers shared quiet stories over cups of Lila's terrible but well-meaning coffee. Every repair, every handshake, every small kindness added another stitch to the tapestry of community they were building. Hope wasn't just the name of the Bel Air anymore. It was the heartbeat of the place. One snowy evening, as Christmas lights twinkled along the eaves, Graham stood by the window watching Sophie and Lila decorating the old pine tree he'd hauled in from the woods. Lila was laughing, trying to untangle a strand of stubborn lights, while Sophie danced around her with armfuls of tinsel. Graham leaned against the wall, arms crossed, a slow smile spreading across his face. He realized he didn't feel like he was waiting for something anymore. Not for the other shoe to drop, not for the pain to come back, not for life to remind him how cruel it could be. He was living now, fully, freely, gratefully. He had learned that love was not about perfection. It was about persistence. It was about choosing, every day, to stay, to build, to believe. And standing here, watching his family glow in the soft light, Graham Hart knew he had finally come home. In the quiet corners of life, where struggle meets solitude, miracles often take root. One exhausted single father, one broken-down car, one heiress searching for more than just freedom. Tonight, under a battered roof and a rain-heavy sky, kindness will spark a new beginning. And two broken lives will discover that sometimes hope arrives when we least expect it. If you believe in the extraordinary power of compassion and second chances, we invite you to subscribe and join our growing family. Together, we keep these stories of love, resilience, and redemption alive. One heart, one soul, one story at a time.